Our guest for today's episode is Sisi Yu. She has completed her master's in interaction design and human AI interaction from Carnegie Mellon University. She has previously interned at Adobe and is currently working as an associate UX designer at Unqork. I am Mayank Khandelwal and you are listening to Whiteboard.fm. Hey Cece, welcome to Whiteboard.fm. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's sunny today here in New York, so at least that's nice.
Hope everything's good out there during this pandemic.
I think New York is hit very hard comparatively, and but I hopefully it'll be better. We're all working from home now, so at least we can work from home, so that's really nice.
Yeah, I hope everything gets better. So, Cece, can you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, sure. My name is Sisi, and I am a product designer based in Brooklyn, New York, and my background is actually in architecture. And after undergrad, I decided I was more interested in like the digital space and as well as kind of how emerging tech is impacting design. And I decided to go to grad school at Carnegie Mellon. But in between, I also did a coding bootcamp just because I think it's really important to understand how designers work with engineers. And yeah, so after it was during Carnegie Mellon that I got to explore kind of different areas of design. And what struck out to me was more like user experience as well as user research. And yeah, I'm just glad to kind of be able to do that as a job now. So it's really awesome.
Nice. Also, Cece, can you tell us more about your story in terms of how did you get started in design?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think even growing up, I was always interested in design, and as I said, but my initial passion is in architecture, so the built environment. And I was also a painter growing up, but I was also interested in the sciences and the math, and I just thought architecture was the combination of all of them. And that was my first understanding of design is large scale, urban scale to kind of the individual homes and but I always thought there was something missing with the user because in architecture you don't really ask the user what they want, and that was the part I was always like confused by because you're designing for people to inhabit the buildings or the malls or like so that was kind of the initial stage where was trying to understand like other types of design where and that's why kind of UX really struck out to me because it's all about the users and empathy is at the key. So yeah, I think it was just more of like the journey, how I understood design through different lenses.
Right. That's great. So, Cece, while after you graduated from Carnegie Mellon, you interned, or after or while you were at Carnegie Mellon, you worked at Adobe as well, right? So, can you tell us what made you apply to Adobe?
Um, Actually, as a designer, I always grew up with Adobe tools. Like I'm sure you're familiar with like InDesign, Illustrator, Photoshop, and now like XD and Premiere Pro and After Effects. So like they have a whole suite of tools, and I'm always interested in how like tools enable people to make things, various things. And I think it's pretty amazing to me just to see how I have no idea how these tools are made, what the people making it behind them. So I'm always interested in like Adobe and how they, the inner works of Adobe. And it's always been kind of like that company that I'm super curious about, but never had the chance to like see it when I was in architecture. Um, because it's all like very like digital focused. So yeah, I think it was just like a natural curiosity and something that I've always wanted to like experience
As a
behind
designer,
the scenes.
everyone really wants to. Adobe definitely comes as one of the companies where they would want to work at and maybe contribute to the company that taught them or them design.
Yeah, how to design exactly.
Yeah. Can you tell us more about the process that was there for getting an internship at Adobe?
It was. I feel like there's no one process because I think at least for me it wasn't so straightforward. Like I applied a couple times like in my first year of grad school, like in the beginning of grad school, and I never heard back. And then I also asked my friend to refer me, but like also didn't hear back. But it was just by chance that I think, and it's also because I think each team hires differently, and then for the different roles. So I guess I was actually very lucky because I applied to the role on Handshake, which is a career platform for schools, through Carnegie Mellon, and then I just got an email one day being like, "Hey, are you interested in the preliminary chat?" And I was like, it was just like so, yeah, kind of surreal because I didn't really expect to hear back because I applied for other positions before. So
That's awesome. Is there were there any more steps or in the process or any tasks that were given to you?
yeah, actually, with I know with every internship is different, but how like my team was hiring was like more, you have first round, which is preliminary like intro chat, and then you which I talked to with my hiring manager actually, and then the next step is I will have to answer a specific question, um, and like which is a specific task. Maybe they ask you about how do you see yourself, how do you see the future of design tools, and like you have to give kind of a proposal, which I presented to the team.
Can you
And
talk more about that?
yeah, actually, I think it's probably different for different teams.
Okay.
But I think it's some kind of like there's always a round of some form of design thinking exercise or design challenge, but this one wasn't so like concrete or rigid like some other design challenges are. This is more open ended because it was in a field that I didn't have like a lot of experience in, so I don't think they were expecting you to be like super proficient either. I think it was more about looking at your thinking process and what your current understanding of AI and design is, and your understanding of like just how can you think outside of the box and think about like company values and how that fits in. So yeah, so I guess I pitched like an idea like about how like AI can work in Photoshop, which actually kind of exists now. So um, so yeah, actually my mindset changed a lot, like from that exercise to when I was actually interning. But I was glad to that was the first time I was thinking about it in terms of like more Adobe specific. So that was a good chance to kind of get to know the team and for them to get to know me. Yeah.
Right. That's great actually. What was the team that you had applied for?
It was called Machine Intelligence Design. So they're pretty new at Adobe. I would say probably like 2 years old, maybe now three. And it's a pretty lean team and consisting of, when I was there, like I think four designers. And so in San Francisco and New York, but primarily New York because our manager was in New York, and their background is all very interdisciplinary. Like all from like I think my manager had like a liberal arts background, but then went to the ITP, which is more like multimedia and um, design, creativity, but also tech. So it was like very cool to get that exposure. And I think our team functioned a little differently from the rest of the teams because we were smaller and more future focused. So the roadmap wasn't the same. We didn't have very strict like deadlines to for feature releases. It was more experimental, and we had a lot of chance to work with the research teams. So yeah, it was a kind of an awesome point because it was very R&D actually.
Nice. Can you tell us more about the project that you worked on during your internship at Adobe?
Actually, I do have a Medium article which I think might be better just to quickly go over the kind of my learnings, high level learnings, because there's some like specific things like I can't really talk about. I think it's interesting because what we were working on was kind of what Adobe was looking into, like the future of creative tools, which like not necessarily replace existing tools, but more like cater towards a different audience or market, because Photoshop, the existing suites are very high. There's a high learning curve, and we're trying to leverage AI ML to use as a kind of creative, kind of collaborative tool to even help new designers to unlock new creative ability without you having to be super proficient in the tool itself. So in the nature of like the team, we kind of like had to think outside the box a little bit because it was all actually, yeah, I can start by like going into kind of um like this is kind of a Medium article that I wrote as a reflection after my internship, and kind of at a high level, like some of the very like difficult constraints are there is a new way of understanding AI ML design, just because you know machine learning is, it's also, there's like two reasons. One being it's kind of a concept hard to grasp by designers, first of all, because it's very technical. Traditionally designers are not really exposed to that. So on the one hand, we have to work with these like technical constraints, but also these things are evolving every day, right? Like machine learning kind of, it's improving, and but also there's a misconception that like AI refers to a huge umbrella of things, and we were specifically focused on like GANs, which is generative adversarial networks, which is for image generation. I mean, you can also use it for like video, but we were focused specifically on images because you know Adobe was looking more at like kind of the visual aspect of things, and images are kind of easier to start with. And so yeah, actually, first of all, like for many people, machine learning is a buzzword, and we realized that we definitely need new vocabularies when we're talking about it. And because there's a lot of pop culture really like popularize it, but ultimately there's like black box. And like I think as a UX designer, our goal is to kind of unwrap that box to reveal to the users maybe like some of what's going behind the scenes, even though it can be a tangled mess at times. Um, and another thing is looking at like what machine learning is good at, which is kind of exploring the latent space. And so these are like kind of variations, and kind of also showing to the user what those variations are, and also like how can we understand what the user wants. So there's that communication gap there, like because the machine learns over time and we need a lot of data to learn from, and that data comes from user feedback. But how do we even get that user feedback in the first place without the user being too like fatigued? We don't want to show forms to them all the time. So even from this, you can see that like I had a really hard time grasping my head around all these constraints in the beginning, and my manager was literally like, here are these reading materials, I'm going to give you a few weeks to like figure out what you want to do, and then if you're really struggling, let me know. So the first few weeks I was really struggling, and the design process is like a constant kind of iteration for me, like kind of a tangled ball for me. Like there's a lot of thoughts going into my head. I realized I could be working on so many things, but at the same time I was limited because I only had like 2.5 3 months. So how do I scope down the problem enough also to work within the constraints, but also it is something that's like interesting to me. It's really hard because I had very like broad scope, and there were so many things that were interesting to me, and I presented so many ideas to my manager, and I thought we have like these weekly critique sessions or feedback sessions, and what I learned over time was I was just too broad. Like every week I was just too broad, so I had to narrow and narrow and narrow down. And yeah, like I think this is, the article itself is a more high level understanding, but for me personally, ultimately I landed on designing the feedback loop, which is at the core, it's more of a conversation between the machine and the user. If you think about like what's the best way to communicate and iterate upon that. So I did a lot of research in regarding to like GAN, so I had to understand like, what do you need to know from the beginning, the user intent of what they want to build or what they want to create, and then how do you like step by step try to understand or unpack the user intent over time, because the user also changes their intent, right? Like you may decide that maybe your design sense has changed, maybe your like likes and wants have changed, and you have to be able to cater towards that. So there's like a lot of these factors in mind, and I think like it was harder because the user research methods are slightly different, because all the existing design methods I learned were for more like known answers. And because machine learning, I have no idea what the kind of the machine thinks. Sometimes there's a lot of uncertainty too. And yeah, so that was definitely like a big struggle. But in the end, I think I learned a lot about just the way to design for machine learning is also kind of designing for the human too, because there can be a lot of ethical issues involved when you're kind of regarding like data or biases. I think I can go into that like more if anyone's interested, but I think at a high level, because like I think sometimes I can feel myself just like talking into the details and then like losing who I'm talking to.
People are
um,
going
but
to,
yeah,
this is extremely new. People are going to find this super insightful.
and I think it's yeah, actually, if anyone's interested, I have a couple of resources where I can point you. And because this field is super new, like when I was interning, I didn't find like too many resources. Like not, I can't really look for Medium for existing case studies. I know Google Pair, like which is their AI design department, just came out with a design guide. I know Microsoft's working on it. Like Facebook has something similar, but it's still very new. And there are more guidelines than like very specific like heuristics or like kind of design processes in place. So it's still very exciting where you can kind of think about your users need and what technology you're working with and create your own process.
Right.
And I think that's the beauty about being like a UX designer, I think, because it's really depending on the context that you're working in. And for me, design tools are more like just your not like mandatory, but more they're just a toolkit, just like, all these creative tools are toolkits that to enable you to do something, enable you to get to your end goal. So it's up to you to decide what's part of your toolkit in this case. And part of you, it's like up to you to decide what your scope is and like what your metrics is. And yeah, actually, I'm really interested in like design and ethics within kind of AI design. And actually, I did my thesis project on like dataset bias for image datasets. And yeah, I think this is a topic that more designers should be invested in because right now it's still very academic in the computer science world. Yeah, I think design has a huge impact on the future of like technology being built. But how can we do that if we don't insert ourselves, like to try to understand that space? I think, yeah, that's where I think like the really interesting part will be is like when we truly are able to determine from the beginning how like maybe even how a product's being built, how the algorithm is designed and how the data set is sourced. So these are conversations we have on my team at Adobe a lot is like, for example, where do we collect the data from? And, it's a huge issue, like, because machine learning, you need data, but Adobe's promise to the user now is like they don't actually collect the data. They don't know what you're working on. But that might change if we need the data to create these like tools. So yeah, I think a lot of it is just conversations about like high level things, just blue sky, like how can we deal with, what if a user uses this for, like to create child pornography, this tool that can create such like amazing images. And is it Adobe's responsibility to stop that? Or even like if people are creating like, fake currency, how can you detect that? So there's a lot of this kind of future thinking where we brainstorm like potential kind of doomsday scenarios, we call it. So like the worst case scenario, like I really think it's our responsibility as designers to consider for those cases as well as the good ones, because we know like, things kind of get abused, tools get abused all the time. And yeah, so I think that's like what was super interesting for me is not only am I part of like kind of on my own design project, we're also having these larger conversations as a team.
That's great. And super insightful. I feel people will find like this will be a lot of very interesting to learn from. Can you also give a walkthrough of the project that you've written on your website?
Yeah, sure. Cool. Um, so yeah, actually, it has a lot more details in here, but it's also like kind of just a hint at like what I was trying to get at over the summer because um and also what was the interesting thing is we actually had to present our summer project at the end of the summer. So all the designers had to present to the whole company, essentially. And I think one challenge I had is like how do you even start to present this kind of project when you need so much background understanding, right? Like which was also a challenge I realized when putting together my portfolio, even talking about it to like other people, is you have to also break it down to it's about communication, like break it down. It's like storytelling, right? Like break it down for your listeners or users. And I think like I found a really effective way is through not through text but through like imagery and diagrams. And this is why I kind of created all these diagrams to kind of outline how I see like this machine and user feedback loop. And yeah, kind of just how they kind of like there's two feedback loops in place but create this one connected system. And yeah, like and I think I did take classes from Carnegie Mellon um, with professors who are doing kind of research. And there's one professor, Paul Pangaro, who I did keep in contact with over the summer. And he said some really great things about how he sees this like conversation model that goes on between the user and the machine. And there's these like decisions in place. And
Right.
because like with the machine, it's very like kind of almost like systematic. Um, so yeah, so it was like nice to kind of like attempt to visualize it as well. And so now I can see like, you know, what are just even like the preliminary understanding, like what should I even like focus on and what things I have to keep in mind as I am designing, because it can be super arbitrary, in my opinion, when you're designing for like something very new or unknown. I feel like I can be lost in this like design like hole. Like I'm just like there's like any constraints. So I'm setting myself constraints in this sense because I think because like my manager did give me the freedom, and I think it was like a very challenging exercise, but I definitely took this experience forward in any future projects I'm making. So yeah. So yeah, in a way, like I definitely separate out my process in terms of like definition, so understanding user high level goals and providing starting input options. So just this is like a quick overview of like how do you understand user intent, just like different ways. Maybe it's through like the onboarding process, you know, like maybe it is through them like defining their preferences early on. Um, yeah, and then the next step is more about like the exploration part. So understanding what kind of the machine is good at, which is providing a variety of options, and two, how the user is able to like interact with the tool. And you know, also how can you be transparent along the way, like how can you tell them what data set it comes from even, or more information about like, because a huge problem in machine learning sometimes is the data set really impacts the results. So if you have, for example, like certain data sets only contain very westernized images, and that is not, you know, I think not okay considering we are designers from all over the world. We grew up with all kinds of context. So I kind of want to address that. And also like maybe how can the user then like provide feedback in that sense, back to the machine to figure out what the user wants or what the user didn't want. And then the next step is how is it like refining. And so it's kind of like how I see it is like the design process is, you know, a double diamond in itself. You expand and then you know, kind of refine on something and then you provide options again. So I see this in this case because as the machine understands over time what the user wants or don't want, it gets better. And as you interact more with the machine, it starts to understand your patterns and your preferences. So maybe at the end, there's also another level of like providing more feedback, or maybe based on your patterns, provide more suggestions for future cases. So it's a constant like loop. And but the key takeaway is, I think in my case, is like AI is really not magic, and nor general intelligence. We're not there yet, and we have to recognize what AI is good for versus what it's not good for, and also consider potential consequences in the meantime, and considerations from the beginning, and also I think this I did take this learning into my Spotify project as well. But also each like AI design team has their own philosophies, but the general idea is like we have to be really careful when thinking about AI, and not just slap it on everything. Like you might see a lot of companies claim that they're using machine learning to do this, but be critical too about like what they're using it for. So yeah, I think that was like my biggest learning is just always look at it with a grain of salt.
That's great. This project is really nice. And what I love about it is how it is in a completely different domain, which I don't think very few percentage of people are aware of, or maybe are even concerned. Ethical AI, it's something which can impact so many lives, but is under research and is under work by very few people, and
Yeah.
it's a sensitive thing and it's very new. Like you mentioned during your project that a lot you had difficulty in finding resources and studying about it and gathering information such that you would be able to make your contribution.
Yeah.
Can you share some resources that beginners can learn or like come across when wanting to explore in the topics of user experience in ethical AI?
So in terms of resources, there's a couple places you can look into. I think IBM has like a AI UX design page. So does Google, and also Microsoft. I would start from there, just like because they gave a pretty great overview of what it is. And I actually also follow a lot of AI UX designers and their work. Especially what they write on Medium and like LinkedIn, and also just talk to them about what they do. That's in terms of like just understanding the day-to-day jobs and the challenges they come across. But I think sometimes you just have to be like hands-on regarding like actual project thinking, like maybe tackle a problem and see where you end up with, and ask people for critique. Yeah, actually I did talk to like a bunch of designers, about like what I made, like, and ultimately it is still design. So you're just thinking about a slightly different framework, maybe. So like I would start from there, and even I think check out just like, I know there are like Medium articles about this, but if you really want to understand, like you have to know what like part of AI you're talking about. Don't generalize terms. So take the time to like figure out the differences, the technical differences. And if you're more curious, then take an intro to, I don't know, like ML class, or like on Udemy, there's a ton of them, or even just get a high level understanding. But yeah, I think there's no like one resource right now. I think I was lucky because Carnegie Mellon had a AI UX like class, so human AI interactions. So actually that was what the class was about, and it was really awesome. But it was just, I think, like, yeah, I think right now there is not that much like resources for that. So you have to like kind of piece things together for yourself.
Sure, makes sense. I feel I was going to suggest that in case anyone wants to study machine learning and AI, for in our colleges at least, or the word around that spreads around is that if anyone wants to study that, they should refer to Andrew Ng's course. But I feel that is very much in depth for anyone, for everyone to learn from it.
I think it's not, I think that's more like a technical side. And I think the approach I took, or like at least at Carnegie Mellon, was awesome because I took classes in the School of Design, which was more like AI kind of product ecology, looking at like service design for AI products. So it's a
Right.
very different lens, and we had a lot of speakers. But the thing is, like, you don't need to actually figure out like how to build your own algorithm to be able to design for it. And most, that's, yeah, I think that's like a big misconception always sometimes, because you end up
Absolutely.
spending a lot of effort in like understanding the technical side, but ultimately you're still a designer. So I would have had conversations with engineers like about what they do, but I think there's a lot of like also I think we use this thing called runway ML. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but um, it's kind of they do the hard part for you, and it's a tool that you can use to visualize different um, algorithms, whether it's like GANs, different types of GANs, like big GAN or like, and you can see the results for yourself, and you can chain things too now, I think. So that was a tool that was in beta when I was interning, and I think it was really helpful to understand like the outputs. So because sometimes it's hard to visualize the outputs when you like you just don't know, right? Like if you don't run the algorithm yourself. Um, but yeah, I think those are just tools I would suggest. And yeah, actually I'm happy to share my like Arena account. I don't know if you know what that is. It's like Pinterest for design, like a collection of resources. So I have a section on there for, like AI design resources. So
For sure. If you can send the link, I would definitely add that to the video, and
mhm.
everyone who watches this video can see it in the description.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think that's usually what I point people to when they ask me, at least.
Awesome. Also, Sisi, can you tell us, based on your experience, what do you feel are the key differences when it comes to UX work for AI native products, and when you're doing UX work for general products that everyone works on a day-to-day basis?
I think there's like you have to break that up even more, because I also there's also other interesting challenges when it comes to I think you I think okay with UX I think you have to break it up to like there's consumer grade, like I think enterprise grade products also have their own very unique like problems to deal with that are very interesting. And also I was actually also interested in designing for like voice, for example, which also is very separate in itself,
Yeah.
and like anything to do with like emerging tech, right? Like kind of tangible interactions, thinking about like IoT products, for example, like a lot of what Amazon's doing, like hardware devices. I think they each have their own challenges,
Yeah.
and AI is just like one of those other challenges you have with new technology or unknowns. Is I think you just have to be open minded and be more inquisitive on your own, because you might not have the same direction or examples to look at on Medium, for example. There are no like kind of existing case studies, because I think what I tend to see on Medium, you have a lot of people redesigning things or apps or food delivery apps, but what I also am excited to see more of is just people thinking more outside the box of like what is the future of just work or food industry look like, especially now with COVID. um, I think it's also more about like say asking like yes and that's kind of a mentality I had at my internship is all right, like this is what we have now, but like what does it look like in 5 years? How can we project what the user might want? And like how do we get there? Like what are the steps? And it was interesting at Adobe, we did have like existing AI features, like teams working at existing products. And the focus is a little different because it's more about immediate execution. Like, all right, these are the features we're going to release. But with kind of more future focused products, it's more like it could be anything. Like it could be on any device technically. So we have to be more just like open-minded about like what we're making and testing it. Thinking about we actually did interview a lot of like AI artists, for example, about how they work, understanding what the needs are, because user needs are also changing, and thinking about new ways to test maybe. And yeah, I think my biggest like advice is maybe just don't take things for granted, like, and also don't be you can't really be rigid about like for example this interaction has to be this way,
Yeah.
because you have to like test everything, and it's also opportunity to come up with new interaction mechanisms, right? Like people are not used to like, because right now I think with a lot of experience design, there's all these design systems in place and existing deadlines that it can be a little harder to innovate. So the space has more opportunities to for you to like just, you know, kind of think broader and like, yeah, just innovate new ways of like interacting with service like devices or tools. So yeah, that's I think in my case that's like what I think is like the biggest difference. But also there's like other considerations like ethics, and which I think should be part of existing design, but maybe with AI it's just more important because of the, you know, the stakes at hand. Um,
Makes a
so
lot of
yeah, I
sense.
think
Yeah.
if you're, yeah, like I mean that is like should be the case. And if you're interested in the intersection of like design and like philosophy, ethics, morals, I think that's like a really good place to be.
Yeah, this is something which I feel is going very much unnoticed, and that everyone should, a lot of designers should focus on it and look at the bigger picture. So to say.
I think it's not just, yeah, it's like the bigger picture, but also like you really can have a lot of impact because with technology, it's creating a way bigger gap regarding like income. There's a lot of studies about how, you know, like biases in AI is causing a lot of communities a lot of harm. For example, like low income, like immigrants, um, and gender is. So yeah, that's I think that's like my motivation is I definitely believe in the ability of design to kind of create better impact, and I think maybe it's different for everyone, you know. But that's like my way of kind of trying to contribute through design.
Absolutely. Good to know that your goal is towards ethical AI and all these technologies that will pave the path for the future. And yeah, kudos.
And and yeah, actually, I think it's also not so like, because it's like a lot of people are like, oh, so is that what you're gonna do like for like, you know, onwards now? I'm like thinking like there's a lot of steps to take you there, and I think I still have a lot to learn in terms of like UX design overall. And um but yeah, it's actually really exciting because you could have the same feeling no matter where you're at. You know, you can be kind of advocating for design or for like fairness, in wherever you're working, your workplace is. So don't feel that if you're not in the field that you're like not contributing. I think like there's like so much to be done still, like in terms of the design world.
Right. That this is great. This like awesome stuff, and yeah, can't wait to see what you are up to in the years to come, and what differences, what impact you will create.
Well, yeah, I feel like it's sometimes just about like it's easy to have like too much pressure being like I need to make this like tomorrow, like this has to happen tomorrow. But with design, I think you also have to be a little more patient and mindful. Change comes like slowly, but also I'm trying to like, yeah, I think I guess like I can just figure like one step at a time.
Yeah,
And I'm also excited because I love connecting with like fellow designers, because you never know what, you know, who you might talk to or who you might inspire to work on a project together. Um, and there's like so much possibilities because, you know, design really exists at every industry, every level. So there's
absolutely.
like, yeah, a lot of opportunities for sure.
That's great. Also, Sisi, can you tell us more about your side projects, for your case studies and side projects? For example, you had done a Spotify redesign project. So if you can give us a walkthrough of that.
Yeah, actually, that was more of a case study than it was. I think it was because it was like very short term. It was actually nice because I had to set very strict like bound constraints, and, you know, understand what I can do in like maybe 2 weeks. And because a lot of my other projects are more end to end, you know, involving a lot of user research, a lot of like repetitive testing, this was kind of a chance for me to be a little more creative um, and yeah. And I also, it was more of like a passion project because I was also interested in like podcasts and how podcasts fit within Spotify. And I kind of approached it like it's like a redesign exercise. So I looked at existing flow, and I did talk to users about their existing experience of podcasts, or like how they currently find new podcasts. And I found out like there are these main pain points, and you probably see this process kind of exists for every kind of UX project, but I think I found it really helpful to look at kind of existing examples, and I think just try to be like more critical about like what what was successful, what was not. And I found that like I think Spotify did a really good job, but there was also this I think issue of like content discovery and personalization, and that was kind of the bit where like AI comes in sometimes. There's just always like, I don't know if you know like the Netflix problems, like you're on a loop. Basically, they only suggest what you watch, and you can't really discover new content. So that was like, this is my attempt at like trying to maybe look at how can we start looking at broadening people's horizons, or like through content discovery. And I did attend this conference, AI, it's called like ML UX conference at Spotify. That basically they talked about like what they, how they work at Spotify, as well as their principles of ML design, and or like identifying friction, automated away, and then they had asked the right questions, and then go manual before you go magical, which really stood out to me because ultimately it is a design process, and you have to like really find the problem to be able to tackle it with AI. So yeah, these are just like things I realized that can just like questions that came up to me during the process, and I encourage everyone to like write questions down as they are maybe using an app or going through a design process, because all these questions will come at the end, when you're trying to critique your own design project. It's like, have I answered those questions? And I just skip a lot of steps here, but like I would just jump like straight to the solution. Okay. So as I was saying, one of the main issues I realized is like the navigation, and it kind of like, this is like just the first issue I kind of noticed people realizing, is that it's really hard to discover podcasts because they're still primarily giving focus to music right now. And although I did read that they are trying to grow their podcast business, so I do foresee in the future that they might want a more balanced view of podcasts versus music. And yeah, and I think these kind of the other features are just broken down into kind of what I discovered from the user insight of like, they hope to connect more with the community and a better personalized experience. And yeah, and also like the last sync calendar is more of just, I was trying to think outside the box, what future features may the user want. And yeah, and I think it was a very almost like fun exercise for me because I didn't have the normal constraints of like work. It was more of a passion project, so I could be a little more creative and think outside the box for this. And at the same time, I did keep kind of this like AI ML considerations in mind. For example, how does it become better over time, and how can we gather user behavior, just active input versus passive collection. And because, as I said, you don't want the user to always be giving you feedback, those pop-ups. And like, for example, also like, what are the metrics to test success? And yeah, just like those are things that are in mind as I am designing along the way. And yeah, we can kind of, I went through these like series of design iterations, and ultimately these are kind of the main features that I landed on. So the first is better navigation between music and podcast. And for example, it will be, you can able to switch from music to podcast from the homepage. So some of these are just like very small changes or seemingly like obvious changes, which I think like it's very necessary also. And if it's obvious, doesn't mean like, it's not good design. And I think that's part of all this whole thing about like making intuitive user experience. And it doesn't have to be like, mind blowing sometimes. And the second part is this like smart search. So I realized, for example, with AI, it's really great at certain tasks. For example, like classifying things, finding connection between things. And so this utilizes that and basically returns categorized results based on relevancy. And you can also toggle between music and podcast, because right now the search just contains like everything. It's all combined. And I think if you can toggle between, it provides more clarity as well. And then for the personalization aspect, I really thought about like, my friend was telling me how he listens to kind of different podcasts, throughout the day. Like maybe on his commute, he will listen to like news channels, versus later on at work, he would listen to more lighthearted shows or like, crime show series. So I thought about maybe it could be interesting to categorize, have different personas for your different times of the day, and you can kind of curate what that looks like. And your return results will also be different. And yeah, that was just like a kind of a new concept I explored, allowing the user to create their own profile, allowing them to customize like length of the podcast, time of day, and yeah. And I just wanted to see like how that would change their listening experience. And then lastly is maybe syncing with their calendars, because I realized people listen to podcasts. One thing is like your schedule really determines what you listen to, depending how much time you have. Also, like I might change my listening habit if I know that one show is coming out, if I know the frequency of when they're coming out with new episodes. So this is a way to kind of, visualize new episodes with your current schedule and seeing how that might impact your preferences. But ultimately, I think I did make a lot of assumptions along the way, because I think that's a huge like lesson I learned is there will always be assumptions, and you have to keep in track of what those assumptions are. So later you can address it or test those assumptions. So people sometimes may not know that like they have podcasts or like they want to listen to podcasts. It is, and I'm also assuming that it is hard to explore new genres. And obviously, you might be a podcast genius and might exactly know where to find things or know what you want. But I assume that most cases people are blurry about that. Like, I might like certain styles. I might not like all crime, because some are much like, they're like, I think with podcasts it's more nuanced, because you have tone, there's a style of podcast, there's different content within different genres. So this is one way of trying to understand what the specific interests of the user might be through time. And I did talk to actually a Spotify designer, and it's funny because I was like, actually it was like very out of the blue. I just like messaged him. I was like, hey, like I'm just like interested in this and I would love to get your feedback. And he said that they're actually tackling this problem at Spotify right now, is the whole podcast, they have a like issue. So it was very kind of eye-opening to understand like his perspective and like their constraints on the company side. And then like after I talked with him, I started to maybe explore new ways of exploring, maybe things that don't fit into their existing design systems. Thinking about maybe there's a better way to explore like latent connections. And this is still like kind of an ongoing project. I got a little kind of busy after that, but I definitely kind of want to continue it at some point. But my biggest learning is there's like understanding where AI ML can come into place versus what might not need AI ML functionalities, determining what kind of information is needed from the user or model training, how to design alongside music navigation. So a lot of it is also understanding like company priorities, right? Like especially when you're at the company. Obviously, I'm not there, so I don't know what their goals are, what their value statements are. Like maybe it's intentional for music to dominate. So yeah, in that sense, like it's obviously very different being like a self-led project versus when you're at the company designing for them. So yeah, that was like ultimately kind of my biggest takeaway through this.
Yeah, that's a really nice project actually. Since it separates, uh, it was like a break for you and also a way to
Yeah.
move to a different kind of space of being more creative and having more leverage. And it's amazing how you really went out of your way to speak to a Spotify designer and took inputs to implement in your passion project, and that speaks volumes about the kind of discipline that you have towards your projects and towards what you do. So that's amazing.
And I think like, and also I think it's also about like intention is like, I don't just want this to be another like design case study or design, like challenge or whatever, but I definitely think like maybe there's things to contribute and to, instigate that like new level of conversation. And also I think I encourage new designers to, not just do it for the sake of doing a passion project, but more like be intentional about it. What are you going to learn from it? Set like goals, like what do you want out of this thing? Like what is the future impact going to be? Like how are you going to have, what are you going to learn from this project? So yeah, I think I'm just more like, I don't really believe in like design for the sake of designing, but more there's a purpose behind it.
Right.
And yeah, that's I think that's like the one advice I would give like incoming designers or new designers.
That's great. Also, what I've realized by looking at your website, CC, is apart from AI native products, your self product projects like the Spotify case study. Another part of your self projects is that you're really into creative coding. So, can you tell us more about that?
uh, I think that's just like something on the side I'm always interested in, is in like different forms of like new media tools. And I was really into processing and like live coding for a little bit. And I think it's just a way to expand, like I'm always like curious about how things are built or how people interact with new mediums. I I think it's all like connected, right? Like I think I'm just like curious about how certain technologies work. I would encourage you people, you to just like be nerdy about it and try to find it out. And I think the creative coding part, it's I think I'm always interested in like, because I did a coding boot camp, so I'm interested in like how do you actually build, what your designs are, but also like creative coding is just less, I think to me it's less like work related, but more just, you can have fun passion projects. And um, there's like a ton of resources out there. Like I would encourage you to look into like p5.js, for example. I'm taking a class on like Super High, which is a coding platform for designers. And that's why I'm also curious about like design tools that uses code. For example, frameworks. You can do a lot with it, once you start understanding that there's like a whole other domain, for example. So yeah, I think it's just like I'm more like on the side, I'm just like super curious about that and how things are built, not just designed.
That's nice. That motive that also gives that basically that uh, what that implies the fact that someone should not stick to one field. Someone should
Yeah.
also be open to exploring multiple domains and see how they can, because in some way or another, whatever you've learned, I believe can be used in every other thing. Like everything is interrelated or can be made interrelated in some way or another.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. And I do believe like design is like a pretty generalist field, because you have to know a lot, like, a lot of everything from research to designing, like to understanding industry. But also I do have like a recommendation for new designers is while you're exploring do understand what your strengths are, whether it's prototyping, whether it's user research, because what I actually found was it is also hard to be a general designer for in terms of like I think you need like that. When people ask about like whether you're a T-shaped designer or an X-shaped designer, I often say I feel like I'm more of like just like a wave, because you have certain like depths, right? Certain strength that you're good at, but then also I'm like proficient in like other things. So figure out, what you're interested in versus what you're good at, and have a stance on things, like have an opinion about like what kind of designer you are as you're exploring these new fields, right? Have like, don't just like take it all in, but also be critical, like synthesize what the information you get. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. That's great advice. So, Sisi, throughout your entire journey, if I had to ask you from the time you started taking a boot camp to the point where you graduated from Carnegie Mellon to your experience at AI native products and your passion projects, what are your top three learnings uh, that you would say you've had which have impacted your growth and in terms of a designer and also as a person?
I think it's like overall learnings. I mean, there are a lot of things along the way, but I think one is just talk about it, like connect with people, connect with, you know, I believe in like I guess like the importance of design mentorship. I had a lot of mentors along the way to help me figure out who I am, like what kind of designer I am, and how do I leverage my background in architecture, in user experience design. And yeah, I talked to so many designers. I think like I learned just so much about like also understanding what kind of work environment, and is that what you want to be in afterwards. And the second learning I would say is just be original, like be who you are, and don't try to be someone who you're not. And like I know it is very tempting to sometimes just copy a portfolio you see if you think it's the best portfolio ever, and it's really easy to be impacted by that. And like I assure you, it's much better to be you than, because companies know when, when if you like copy a project, and it's a very small community ultimately. And I think it's also important for you to have your own voice about things, because everyone has their own unique outtake on design. And I think my last advice is like, I think just be always explore, always challenge existing things. Be critical of your, of everything you see, like obviously with a constructive lens, and seek design feedback. And design is an iterative process, as many of you may know, and it takes time. And also be able to admit that if you don't know something, or like I think it's really crucial to also be humble through the process too. And some of the best designers, some of the most like humble people I've met. And it's really not about like ego, because ultimately you're designing for like people. And yeah, always remember kind of like who your users are. Be human about your designs. So yeah.
That's great. That's great advice. And I feel a lot of beginners would implementing this would help them grow a lot and be better, not just in terms of their skill and craft, but also in terms of them being growing as a person.
It's the same for advice I would give for people crafting their portfolios. Like, don't just put everything. Be thoughtful about what you say and what you put on.
Definitely, definitely. Thanks a lot for being a part of this episode, Sisi. This brings us to the end of our interview, and like I feel there's a lot of knowledge that viewers would gain from this episode in terms of AI native products and GANs and basically the design of the future and great stuff. Wish you the best and can't see what you're up to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks you for organizing this. This is really cool for new designers.
Thanks for listening to this episode, and I hope you liked it.
If you watched the entire video, drop a comment below sharing your favorite learnings from this interview to let us know. Subscribe to the Whiteboard.fm YouTube channel to check out other episodes and clips from this interview. This podcast is a part of the 10K Designers Network. You can check out other projects on 10K Designers